Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. And here we are again, episode 57 of the Near Memo with David, Mike, and Greg, talking about the week in local, social, and commerce. We've been tallying our reader survey responses, and we're getting some very interesting responses. We'd like you to take the survey, which if you get our newsletter, you'll get an opportunity to do tomorrow or yesterday or last week, depending on whenever you. I always screw up on the time thing, but anyway. So please take our survey. Soon we're going to be introducing some paid options, and it's very helpful to us to get your feedback. And we've learned some.
And if you're listening to this or watching it on video, the link will be available on our website, and I'll link to it in the notes from this session.
Yes, and please subscribe to the newsletter while you still can. He says ominously. All right, so we're going to jump right in this week with you first, David. Moz did a survey, Moz did a study, rather. I've got surveys on the brain. Moz did a study about featured snippets and ranking position and characteristics of snippets. So why don't you tell us about that?
That's right. Yeah. So my former colleague, Dr. Pete Myers of Moz, published a survey, or now you got me saying it too, Greg, published a study in conjunction with his the Get Stat team, which Moz acquired several years ago, analyzing. So for those who aren't familiar with featured snippets, they're the sort of the box that appears at the top of the organic search results, where there's usually either a table or a series of bullets, or in some cases a short paragraph that attempts to answer the question that you typed into the Google search box without actually necessitating a click through to a page. So this is an example, or it's one example anyway, of the kinds of things that Rand Fishkin includes in this zero-click search definition, where Google is trying to answer your question without directing you to an actual website. So the value from an SEO perspective of featured snippets is perhaps mitigated versus the value of a number one organic position, where Google's not giving away quite as much information. But that said, they still tend to be seen as fairly valuable by SEO agencies and in-house folks. And a relatively good indicator of how strong your page or your domain is performing for a given keyword. Okay, end of the setup. So in January of 2020, prior to January 2020, the page from which a featured snippet was extracted would actually appear further down the page in organic results. So it was very obvious that, say, the page that was ranking in position 5 was driving that same featured snippet. Google removed that duplication in January of 2020. And so since then, it's been much harder to identify where that page might appear organically in the set of results for a given keyword. Dr. Pete and the Get Stat team went back and looked at historically, like when things changed, what was ranking previously in that in a given slot for a given keyword, and so where that result disappeared, it became obvious where that result was ranking previously. They basically found that positions 1, 2, and 3 still drove the lion's share of featured snippet extractions, but I think the long tail was something like 20% of positions 4 through 10. We're still responsible for those featured snippets. So there's essentially still an opportunity, even if you're getting creamed in the number one position, to leapfrog those top 3, top 4 results with a really well-structured answer to a particular query. So that was one big takeaway, is the opportunity to leapfrog the dominant organic results, which with a featured snippet is still available. And then the second big takeaway was, Greg, I think that the image you linked to in this week's newsletter describing this story was actually in a separate report, but it was a very interesting sort of follow-up report to this study, which showed that featured snippets almost never co-occur alongside local packs. So featured snippets are essentially the domain of a pure organic result and that Google almost never shows them alongside local pack results. And that had a really interesting, it's interesting sort of in and of itself, but B, it also speaks to the, I think, in my opinion, the more transactional nature of local intent queries, that Google is not trying to satisfy a local intent query with a knowledge-based answer. It's trying to satisfy those local intent queries with brick and mortar locations where someone could actually conduct business as opposed to learn more about a particular topic. So that's just it kind of speaks to the intersection of sort of local and commerce, which is one of our big sort of intersections that we like to cover at Near Media. And I think we'll see in the later part of today's Near Memo, Google moving even farther in that direction when it comes to trying to satisfy local queries with commercial results.
I would say it's not necessarily the case that knowledge and transactional intent are mutually exclusive. I mean, you might be looking for a certain kind of service provider near you for information preliminarily, but for example, I'm thinking about buying a heat pump in replacing my conventional furnace with a heat pump. Well, heat pump, HVAC, whatever, near me would yield some vendors, some service providers, but it also might be helpful to have everything you need to know before buying a heat pump at the top of that result. So there are occasions where I could imagine the two would be complementary, but for whatever reason, Google does not see them in that way.
But that speaks to the difference in your queries, right? So everything I need to know to buy a heat pump is a research-oriented term.
Yes.
And it's not I need to buy this thing right now term, heat pump providers near me. Yeah.
It's true, but often it's true. That's okay. I'll leave it at that. I won't dispute that. There is a longer discussion there about intent and how people formulate queries. But the other thing that I think is worth pointing out about the study is that snippets were only showing up for about 15% of desktop queries in the United States. They looked at four English-speaking markets, and the U.S. had the highest frequency, and they show up less frequently on mobile. So it's a minority scenario. And then back to the point about is it really valuable to be in that position? I think that the consensus SEO opinion is yes, but I think I saw some Ahrefs data that was saying it was like only an 9% click through or something versus the top organic position.
That's right. So there has been, and I unfortunately don't remember the exact conference. It was back in the days when I attended conferences in person, but there is some mitigating data to suggest that the actual click through on the number one organic result is higher than the click through on a featured snippet.
Yes, that is true. That is correct.
Yeah.
And it's a multiple. I think I think it's more than 2x.
But so the flip side of that, just to close the point here, is the flip side of that is that the click through on a featured snippet probably exceeds that of the fourth or fifth or sixth position. So it's still in your interest if you're further down the page to try to leapfrog those top three results top handful of results with a really well structured answer.
And Google Assistant and Google Home Nest devices draw upon featured snippets very heavily. And there is some branding in that audio context that doesn't really exist on the web, because it says, according to the website, blah, 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 dogs can't eat chocolate or whatever the query is. And you're just getting a visual on the web, and there's almost no branding in the snippet. So, the number of queries on these devices is relatively small versus desktop or mobile. Mike, anything to add before we move on to the next topic?
I was just studying up for my topic since we
All right. Okay.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.